So I think that we are good to go now. So without further,
Judge, sorry for interrupting. Can you please wait for a sec? Okay, sorry, you can start now.
Okay, thank you. So now I think we're good to go. And without any further ado, I'd like to call upon Prime Minister.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Awesome. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Look, Facebook is obviously great, but its size means that it can amass massive amounts of data, harming our privacy and being able to influence exactly how we think down to election results. It means they can buy up competitors, stifling any competition. And it means they're completely unaccountable because no one wants to switch to any other social media platform, even after Facebook has done some horrific things. Because of all these reasons, we think that we would break up Facebook. Several things in this speech. 3 arguments. First, how this stops one company controlling all access to data. Second, how you create more competition and accountability. Third, how this makes Facebook and social media easier to regulate. Before that, some of the model. What do we mean by breaking up? We're talking about separating Facebook into its constituents. For example, Messenger being one spin-off company, newsfeed from friends, having newsfeed from actual news, having a video page. Secondly, this looks like spinning off the companies that Facebook has already bought. So for example, Instagram and WhatsApp. Third, for other companies that are too big, we are also happy to break them up. Before I start, 2 bits of framing. First, we think that alternative mechanisms are insufficient and have already proven to be insufficient. 4 reasons why. First, Facebook understands the social media scene the best. They are always able to find loopholes, especially because they're such a large company. Second, we think legal suppression is likely to happen. They can compile the best lawyers and refute whatever lawsuit is brought against them. Third, because they're so big, they have a vast amount of resources. So for example, they're able to set up in areas where regulations don't exist or use these resources to suppress lawsuits again. Fourth, the government is always playing catch up when regulating social media. This is particularly bad if it's as big as Facebook, which means it's very difficult to control. We think the status quo and the failure to regulate Facebook even after the Cambridge Analytica scandal shows how current mechanisms and whatever government intervention is likely to fail. Second piece of framing, Facebook is likely to continue to expand. It already has a lot of people, and through the network effect, it's likely to get even more people. So for example, right now, all my university stuff is on Facebook because it's just the place where everyone has an account and it's the easiest for everyone to access. So arguments. First, why does breaking up Facebook stop one company from controlling all access to data? Currently, we think that Facebook has data on everything there is to know about you. They can access your WhatsApp, your Instagram, your Messenger. They know what you post, what you like on Facebook, how much time you spend on social media. They can give a very, very accurate portrayal of exactly who you are. This is really bad because it looks like targeted ads. This looks like Cambridge Analytica, where there was data mining from Facebook to have targeted political advertisements that were fake. We think this only happens when you have access to a vast trove of data that is only accessible when you have so many different branches of Facebook that encompass every single bit of your life. This is terrible for 3 reasons. First, Facebook can obviously be hacked. This would be terrible if all your personal information could be divulged in just one instance of hacking. Second, this data can be bought off for political purposes and intimidation. And this is terrible, right? Because if you're able to influence people's political decisions, for example, making you vote one way or another, this is taking away one of the core rights that everyone should be able to have, the ability to influence democratic elections and have a say in what kind of world you're living in, what laws you're living under. So this is terrible. Third, we think that principally anyone having this degree of information on people is really bad. Because we think people also aren't aware of this information being used in such a way against them. And it's very hard to consent into. So even if people might consent into Facebook, we think they don't really read the terms and conditions. And also because everyone else is using it, it's really difficult for you to opt out, even if you're really opposed to Facebook using your data in such a way. So we think the comparative on our side is that when you break up Facebook, you only get data from newsfeed. from one company. You only get data from Instagram or only from Messenger. We think this is not enough to be able to build a specific targeted profile on you. So all the harms are really dimmed on our side of the house. Second argument, how does this create more competition and accountability? So first, let's look at accountability. We think currently Facebook doesn't really have competitors because people don't have the incentive to join competitors because Facebook is too big. So there is a collective action problem. It would be great if everyone left Facebook, but if only one person leaves, i.e. if you choose not to participate in Facebook, this only causes harms to you, and therefore it's really difficult for you to opt out, especially given the network effect where one person knows lots of other people who know lots of other people, which Facebook allows. So for example, even after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which was terrible, where people actively wanted to boycott Facebook and try to get this trending, they didn't succeed because it was just too difficult for individual people to opt out. So what this means is normal market mechanisms that make sure Facebook don't do outrageously harmful things don't happen. So Facebook is able to use our data in atrocious ways without actually getting the backlash they deserve. The impact on our side, what happens when you break them up is Facebook is no longer able to monopolize everything. The network effect no longer exists as strongly, and so people can turn to other forms of social media. This creates a deterrence compared to knowing you're above the law and above any backlash, so Facebook won't do this shady thing in the first place. But secondly, if something bad really does happen, people are able to switch, which is good. Secondly, how does this create more competition? We think this lessens Facebook's ability to buy other companies. So instead of code, they can buy Instagram, WhatsApp, and copy Snapchat stories, because even with litigation, we think they're unlikely to face much backlash. Before I move on, OO.
Yeah, we think that this probably only applies to social media companies, given that buyouts are a significant source of revenue for other startups. How does that really weigh on the comparative?
So if this only on social media companies, we think this motion is specifically talking about Facebook. We don't see how that's relevant. So moving on, we think that less ability to buy other companies is good because this means you can have more innovation and more dynamism, where currently Facebook is too large and can extract profits in the future and start charging for services because there's no alternative. All the problems with monopolies. That's why we break them up. We think they have less ability to do this and exploit people. Third argument, why does this make Facebook easier to regulate? We think that first, Facebook no longer has so many legal reserves and so much money because it's broken up. This means that we can regulate them because they're smaller and they're much easier to manage. Secondly, we think this also means that Facebook has less political power insofar as the information it has is no longer useful. So we think this is really good because lobbying is terrible and prevents them from being regulated. So we think any party that has some control of Facebook will have no political incentive to do so. Therefore, we think we're much better able to regulate Facebook. What I've told you is how we prevent the most pernicious harms of Facebook, prevents it from getting access to all our data in one go, prevents it from continuing to stifle innovation and accountability. So proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for the speech, and I'd like to call upon the first speaker for the opposition.
Hi, can I get a quick confirmation that I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool, thanks so much. For everybody in the round, I will not be on Zoom while speaking, so if you have a point of information, please just unmute yourself, say which team you are, opening or closing, and I'll take you around 5 minutes. Cool. 3, 2, 1. I think it's really important to note that OG has fallen prey to the trap that basically all of Western news media has, and that's just assuming that if anything is even close to a monopoly, it is on face bad. We're going to give you 3 reasons why specifically in the tech space, monopolization is probably good, even in OG's best case, meaning that they're weighed fully out of the round. First argument here is that you discourage innovation in the long term. Look, R&D is insanely expensive because engaging in research development means that you're dedicating a significant percentage of the company into conducting research into a product that may or may not even come to fruition. This percentage of the company could make guaranteed revenue by continuing to work on the company's core product. So the result between the guarantee of getting some revenue versus the possibility of losing a significant portion of revenue, most small companies are unlikely to take on the risk of developing a new product. Second reason, though, is because synergies exist between different subsidiaries of Facebook. You're better able to decrease the cost of research and development because you have the economies of scale effect, where you have built up research and development infrastructure and certain experts available in a litany of fields that can all work together to develop a product rather than relying upon sporadic hiring practices from smaller companies. This means that monopolies will have a much easier time justifying and executing on this risky decision of choosing to invest in research. This is for two reasons. First of all, monopolistic companies do not have to feel threatened by competitors and therefore are more likely to take risks because they aren't worried about other companies overtaking their core product and business. Essentially, the lack of competition gives these large monopolistic companies room to take risks without the potential fear that spending time away from making revenue will allow other companies to catch up or even leapfrog over them in their product. But also, secondly, they're free to set their own prices. Therefore, they can set prices above the exact cost to produce a good by a significant margin. This means that in a monopolistic world, the monopolizer is far more likely to make a significant sum because of the overcharging, quote unquote, due to a lack of competition. This increased fund means that these companies have the capacity to take on the risk because they know that they have the revenue to survive the negative consequences of the worst case scenario of research and development when a product results in no monetary yield. Note that this will concretely outweigh any concerns that the Gump bench will have with increasing costs for two reasons. Because these costs do not get immediately passed on to a consumer, we don't have to pay to use Facebook, but also secondly, because of the scale of Facebook, those costs that they place on companies through advertising are really, really spread out. There are a few impacts here. Innovation gets knifed. Cutting-edge technology like self-driving cars, artificial intelligence, machine learning, conducting cutting-edge research into virtual reality all goes away. These technologies have impacts in helping out-of-reach communities get to work, make certain products more easily available, predict disasters, increase healthcare quality, and a litany of other impacts that we're already realizing just by having a cell phone. Removing Facebook's ability to innovate makes attaining this future critically impossible. Second argument, we're hurting startups' existence in the long run. Two warrants why this is true. First, Facebook provides a significant source of revenue through buyouts. Again, OG just contests the claims that, buying out companies is bad, but critically, it's the only source of revenue for new startups in the tech space. This is because venture capital investments are incredibly risky in the tech sector, given how fast companies can rise and fall, evidenced by how they've already been burned by the dot-com bubble or WeWork's catastrophic failure the past year. Startups don't have the structures built up to take a significant hit and bounce back, as well as an established company. At the same time, many startups don't have, especially in the tech space, obvious revenue streams to encourage that investment in the first place. This means that it's incredibly difficult to provide evidence that would convince venture capitalists to invest in a startup. What's the comparative, though? On our side of the house, Facebook can provide that revenue for them to continue to operate even once they've been bought out. This revenue will allow them to keep most of their jobs, which is on the comparative more than if the company is literally forced to close, while also allowing them to continue to develop the products that they're passionate about. Second thing here, you're preventing market overcrowding. The buying out of companies that OG is afraid of is actually good for new companies. In a certain field, the more providers there are for a good or service, the more choices consumers have, which means that each company competing will have a smaller percentage of the market share instead of a few players having a significant share. This means that new startups are unlikely to get the revenue they would need to even achieve profitability because they have a much smaller user base due to overcrowding. Facebook buying out companies fixes this problem in two ways. First, it gives Facebook's credence to these startups, which means users have a greater incentive to pick them over other startups. If I know that Facebook is backing a company as a consumer or even as an investor, I'm far more likely to actually use that company's product. At the same time, it also creates space in the market, which allows new startups to actually get a user base they can use to grow rather than a minimal one in a crowded market. This is how you actually access the competition that OG thinks is so important. You don't get it in an overcrowded market. But our third reason why you hurt startups is because startups in the status quo get a comparatively less expensive and streamlined access to a huge user base through Facebook advertising. Because essentially, if I buy an ad on Facebook, it also trickles down to Instagram, into WhatsApp, into like Oculus Rift, into a ton of other products, all through one specific investment. And as OG themselves already concedes, which has a size of like billions of users. On the comparative, like if a company has to pay for billboards that only access like 100,000 people or something like that, it is incredibly difficult for them to garner the same access into a meaningful user base that they need to actually grow, right? But also we think that ultimately, even in OG's best case, their only impacts apply to social media startups where Facebook operates. But first of all, there are obviously successful social media startups like Instagram before they were bought up, Snapchat, which is still currently thriving. They already exist. This competition isn't really like, this competition still exists. However, on our side, you knife literally the entire rest of the tech sector who is dependent upon the money from Facebook, the market share from Facebook, and the advertising from Facebook to even begin to survive. We think that firmly outweighs OG straight out of the round. But our final argument here is that just going to turn the entirety of OG case, and that's that essentially, once you break up Facebook, Chinese conglomerates like Tencent and WeChat are just going to do the exact same thing, buy up all the companies and lead to the exact same issues, but with less regulation. First reason why this is true is that Chinese tech giants are already doing so in the status quo. Chinese tech giants like Alibaba and Tencent are massive state-supported giants that operate in a similar vein to Facebook, and that they look to buy up new startups across the globe to strengthen their own companies. Buying out startups provides an innate head start in developing new products, as these startups tend to be more specialized and therefore capable of developing products faster and more thoroughly. Before I move on, though, I'll take a point from closing if they have something. Cool, opening. All right, I'll just keep going then. So This means that Chinese conglomerates are innately advantaged developing new products because Facebook would be forced to develop from the ground up, while Tencent and Alibaba could just buy a startup that's 30% of the way there and absorb their progress. At the same time, the subsidiaries we spin off from OG under their model are just going to get bought up anyway because they have a resource reliance on critical synergies with a large scale of Facebook, right? Because Instagram is already integrated with Facebook, because WeChat is already integrated with Facebook, there's built-in infrastructure that leverages these connections to actually allow them to operate. That infrastructure goes away, but that doesn't remove their dependency. The only other companies that can provide that same infrastructure then are Chinese conglomerates, so they're just going to get bought up on the comparative. The second point here is on scale. Tencent and Alibaba's size mean that they benefit from economies of scale, and that their production of goods and services becomes cheaper because of the size of their audience, which they can then leverage to further their own products. If Facebook is broken up, they lose the same advantage, that they're no longer able to produce at scale and connect their services together to increase utilization of their products, which again creates an innate advantage for Chinese conglomerates. The impact of being unable to mitigate China's influence here is disastrous. First of all, companies like Alibaba and Tencent have direct links to the Chinese government, and that their track record of protecting user privacy is incredibly spotty, to the point where it's fully possible that user data is sold to the Chinese government. At the same time, developing countries are going to become reliant upon President Jinping to spread the authoritarian regimes outward. We're going to turn the entire argument from OG, who's more likely to influence elections, who's more likely to stand up towards regulation, Facebook, an American company, or the entire Chinese Communist Party and an international community. We think you get the same harms that OG talks about, but just far less checkbacks against them on their side of the house. Proud to propose or oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for the speech, and I'd like to call upon the second speaker for the government.
Cool. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Right, let me just get my timer up. Right. Hello spoke really fast and said a lot of things in that speech, but I think a lot of it wasn't really relevant and didn't engage at
You
Sorry,
can mute yourself.
Yeah, can I just start again? Whoops. Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
sure.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Alex said a lot of things and spoke really fast, but I don't think much of it engaged with any of Sharon's material. A lot of the stuff about consumer harms are still around, apart from some crazy thing about China coming in instead. I didn't think this debate would become about some sort of weird China extension, but I guess it did. My speech here is going to be like structured around the two crucial things that we think determine when you break up a monopoly. Firstly is when the monopoly isn't in consumer interest, and secondly, when that monopoly inhibits future competition. I think on both of those grounds we're able to win. This is kind of obvious ground. Like, this is the ground that was set up when you broke up other previous monopolies like Standard Oil or like Microsoft, etc. Okay, on the first thing, in terms of consumer interest, Sharon gives you structural reasons as to why the specific existence of Facebook, which is that it's not just that it has loads of users, but crucially it has loads of fingers in different pies, means it's able to collect massive amounts of data that are harmful to the individual. It does things like collect constantly on the news that you have or on the preferences that you may want to fulfill. I think that this is really important in terms of proving consumer interest. I want to just fully flesh out as to what this looks like. So if Facebook gets in all of this data on people and has access to all these various different streams, this is absolutely horrific, because then it means that people can go towards Facebook, ask for buying that data, whether it be for other firms or whether it be like political things like Cambridge Analytica, for instance, and basically gain a full profile on these people, almost knowing more about these people than the consumers themselves know about each other. That means they can then do things like really subtle manipulation of these people's preferences. They can urge them to buy particular goods in the less extreme case, or in the most extreme case, they can nudge them towards voting for political parties and diminish their own preferences. I think this is absolutely incredibly harmful, because the reason that these people didn't choose to act in these particular ways was actually coerced into it by this opaque Facebook company, which they don't really have any much understanding out of. Opening opposition try and say alternatives exist, and presumably closing might try and emphasize this even more, that like you can opt out of Facebook. I don't think this is true for the reason that Sharon gives, which is that namely, as Facebook expands, there's more and more of an massive cost of leaving Facebook, because you're abandoning all these various people you had networks to, given that's the whole point of why people will come into Facebook, which means that over time, as Facebook continually expands, you're far less able to leave it. And I think that this is really true. You can't just point to other social media services existing tracking, oftentimes people have accounts on Facebook in addition to this. So I think people are really unaware of how this data is used, and this data is used to massively harm them. The reason that for the reason that like they're in control in these ways and being continuously manipulated. None of that material gets any degree of response, apart from the fact that opening opposition suggests that at the point at which you break up Facebook, other Chinese startups come in and buy all this stuff up, and that's likely to be worse. I have quite a few responses to this. The first thing is just that I don't think that these Chinese startups these like takeovers are going to be allowed. Like the US has already shown a track record of saying it doesn't particularly like TikTok entering these areas. It's already banned it. I think that if these companies come in and they try and buy up these various subsidiaries of Facebook, that's really unlikely to occur. And it seems like a really, seems like a really strange comparative to try and suggest. But also, secondly, like we can try and limit them to, we probably can support breaking up these sorts of social media giants in the long term, etc. So I think we can prevent against these takeovers from happening. I think this data harm is a massive thing in and around that needs to be engaged with. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from closing, preferably. Closing? No? Okay, I'll move on then. All right then. Secondly though, why do you get less innovation? And this is where the majority of the opening opposition exists. The LO claim is that you can get more revenue, and so that makes you able to afford research and development, etc. I think the first thing is that innovation, their examples here are really weird. Like, why does Facebook do things like flood forecasting, all these other things? Presumably other big tech firms exist even on our side of the house. We only have specific problems with Facebook because it's the one that has a tendency of anti-competitive practices, and it's the one that's able to do this data collection. So presumably these other big tech firms, such as Google, for instance, continue to do this sort of good innovation they talk about. But also, quite obviously, I'm pretty sure that more competition causes research and development, right? Like at the point at which you have lots of different firms in the same space that are competing to get users, then presumably you have a massive incentive to innovate, to differentiate yourself from those other competitors, for the reason that that's what enables you to get some sort of more people to buy your particular company, because you have a qualitative difference with that company, with like qualitative difference to your other competitor. This is obviously unnecessary R&D now, because of the reason that because of the fact that you don't need to do this with your Facebook, because as Sharon explains, everyone continues to join because so many people exist there already. The other thing that's worth noting here is that the firms on our side of the house aren't tiny. Like WhatsApp is still quite large and still has some element of capital reserves. Yes, maybe it's not to the same extent as overall Facebook, but it still has some ability to do things such as research and development. I think you have to weigh that research and development that opening opposition talk about, which I don't think is unlikely, but even in our best case, if there is marginally more innovation on their side of the house, you have to weigh that against the massive data harms that exist in terms of like the massive data harms that exist when you collect this data. So yeah, it's unclear why Facebook it's also unclear on their side of the house as to why Facebook will continue to do this R&D. Insofar as it wants to profit maximize, its R&D has an unclear return for it. It's unclear why it would even engage it in the first place. It's probably easier to just do lots of things like advertising, for instance, and try and get more and more people on its platform rather than doing all this positive research and development. The other claim they have then is about how this harms startups, because actually startups get loads of money via, I don't know, via buy-ins. I think this is non-unique. Again, presumably other large internet companies such as Google can do this, but also it's unclear how social media companies are even able to get big in the first place on their side of the house when Facebook is able to erect these barriers to entry, where it has this massive incumbency advantage because it already draws upon all these different people. I also think their reasons of why venture capital is quite limited is actually kind of ludicrous. Like you have things like the SoftBank initiative, which for instance massively funds these startup companies, even that get loads and loads of funding. All you need is like a Silicon Valley mentality where you have this sort of new idea. I think there is lots of venture capital funding that exists purely because people are enthused by tech companies such as Facebook, which shows that it has been successful. So I don't think that material really stands at the end of the round. I think what does stand is that the unique harms that Facebook is able to do, because it has all of its fingers in different pies, because it's able to subtly manipulate people, that can only be prevented, as Sharon explains to you, not with regulation, but through breaking it up. That's what we enable. Proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for the speech, and now I'd like to call upon the second speaker for the opposition.
Thank you. Give me just a second. All right. Just on POIs, I'm going to request that you just vocalize them so that I can hear you, and just let me know if you're opening or closing, and that way I'll be able to take you as well. All right, look, I think what comes out of opening government is interesting, right? Because they tell you they're going to give us all of these reasons for like why keep breaking up bigger monopolies is bad. And then they tell you this debate is solely focused on Facebook, should not be extended to startups, things like that. Two things you're going to get from my speech, right? Firstly, on this contention of like data privacy and like what weighs out, whether we consider it to be important and whether that's even likely going to happen in our world. But secondly, on what DPM refers to as some crazy thing about China because he doesn't seem to want to respond to it. I'm going to explain to you why this wall or counterfactual is likely under our side of the house and why it's important to consider in this debate, right? So firstly, on the idea of like data collection, right? We hear from them initially that like it's super bad to have this like one big company have access to all this data. Facebook has data on everything you know like from and can access like targeted ads, data from data mining for like political ads and things like that, right? So we hear a lot of analysis on this and like why Facebook should be broken up principally just because of this. Firstly, we think that this is non-comparative and that they don't engage with what this looks like in the counterfactual, in which we think these things are likely going to continue happening. But secondly, we think that on the counterfactual, it actually gets worse because of all of the warranting Bob gives you about how these harms are then transported and transferred into like companies in China, which have much lesser regulatory checkbacks and things like that. But thirdly, we think that all of this like data collection thing is extremely available in the public sphere, especially now, given things like Cambridge Analytica and all of the lawsuits that Facebook is currently facing, right? We think that's extremely important to keep in mind that people continue to make this trade-off knowing this information. We think it's far less likely that they're going to have this information on or what companies are doing in the counterfactual in a world in which you do break up Facebook simply because these like lawsuits and things don't exist. But in fact, we think it's important to recognize this panel because it's a false characterization that people just don't know what Facebook is doing with that data. We think even in the instance that Facebook is like taking up this data and things like that, that actually they're less likely to continue to do so because they are currently facing competitions from other bigger companies and things like that. We think their key focus is ultimately their consumer base and they want people to continue using their consumer base. And now this includes things like Instagram and WhatsApp and things. And so we think that they have like an incentive to continue to like reduce this like invasion of privacy thing that you cannot control in the counterfactual, right? But then what you hear from the second speaker is essentially this, right? Like that you don't necessarily get some sort of like opt out that for some reason like there's going to be subtle manipulations of people's actions and things like that. We think this analysis extends from their first speaker where they don't respond to any of the reasons or the weighing we give you on how this like is not as important to consider when you look at things like discouraging R&D and innovation and things like that. The only response we get to that is this idea that like all you need to get funding for is a Silicon Valley mentality, which is a lovely idealism to hear from probably some sort of Silicon wannabe, but we don't think that that's the actual, or like that's how the actual world works. We think that's extremely important to consider that like when you think of companies like Alibaba or Tencent, which by the way is not a Chinese startup, that they're far more likely to look at what's beneficial, no thank you, what's economically beneficial for them in terms of being able to pick up some like minor company that's already 30% done because like Facebook was able to like create that growth and then pick off from there as opposed to looking from other startups that have not had this like time to grow and things like that, right? So then what do we give you on the idea of like some crazy thing that happens in China, right? And this is extremely key. We tell you that the counterfactual of breaking up Facebook is not just that you're going to create some like, oh, happy world of like smaller companies living in the US, Snapchat separate, Instagram separate, Facebook separate and things like that. We tell you that what you're going to have is other companies coming and picking up these like data, these like available technologies, etc., and taking them to countries like China where we see things like WeChat and stuff like that. We're telling you that it's far more harmful on this like counterfactual because of a couple of reasons, right? But firstly, because on the idea of like no regulation and no checkbacks, right? We tell you that it's actually more dangerous for like tech giants like Alibaba and Tencent to come up and like pick up these startups, pick up startups from across the globe and take it to China. We tell you that you then give them the advantage of being able to have like partially developed startups and be able to use their economies of scale to further develop them, right? But then we tell you that the other impact of like China's influence is disastrous simply because the counterfactual has these same harms that you get on government side, but in a world in which we cannot or we do not actually have like a legal or judicial system to control it, but more importantly, a world in which people don't actually have access to what these companies are doing with their information and data because they don't have the kind of clout that Facebook does. But before I go on, I'll take closing.
Right. So your entire case is premised on the fact that Facebook will do a lot of innovation on its own and other companies can't. But the ones that do manage to innovate, like Instagram and WhatsApp, that manage to outdo Facebook, Facebook has violated antitrust and bought them off. Please engage on companies that will be able to compete with Facebook.
Right, this is like unclear, or not, like I'm unable to understand this, because we don't necessarily think that like Instagram or WhatsApp is going to be able to compete with Facebook at the scale in which it exists today, right? We tell you that the scale in which Facebook exists, in that it controls Instagram and WhatsApp and things like that, gives it that economies of scale, gives it the power to support these startups, to create infrastructure that actively allows startups to grow in our world, right? We tell you that insofar as you buy, the venture capitalists are ultimately profit-minded and are looking to like make the most that they can from like innovation opportunities and things like that, that they're unlikely to like invest in like a risky tech sector in which companies are not necessarily going to be able to compete as well. We tell you that Facebook gives these companies the unique benefit of like being able to operate in a scale in which they wouldn't be able to in the counterfactual. We tell you this exists for a couple of reasons. One, because they have access to a huge consumer base, because they're given this like online ability to compete that they wouldn't necessarily have otherwise, right? Like Baf tells you, this trickles down through Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. We think that like key sort of synergy between the subsidiaries is important to consider. When they're separate, this goes away. We think that this is on balance harmful. But more importantly, we give you the analysis about overcrowding, right? We tell you that this like buying out of companies that OG is afraid of is actually good for new startups, because we prevent overcrowding in a world in which they're like fighting to succeed, right? We tell you that the analysis we hear from OG on like better competition for companies, in that like it's gonna somehow like increase the ability of companies to grow. We tell you, one, that it's not necessarily applicable in this case, because their harms are only available to social media companies. The harms we give you on balance extend to all companies, whether that's like tech startups and things like that. We tell you, when you weigh these out, we take it over them. But more importantly, we tell you that it's actually harming startups, and the characterization they give you is less important. We tell you that it's comparatively less expensive to advertise on a platform like Facebook because of the scale that it achieves, and it streamlines to a far larger user base. So on balance, what have we given you at the end of the debate, right? The only real argument we hear from them is this like the privacy and data thing. We tell you, one, that it's non-comparative and it's unlikely to happen given Facebook's or like public lawsuits and things like that. We tell you, two, it gets worse on the counterfactual. But on the idea of like China, we tell you that you're actually hurting abilities of startups to grow under your world, and that on balance, we achieve a better world for tech companies and for the future, and for a user base of like these social media platforms. We beg you to oppose the motion. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for the speech, and I would like to call upon the third speaker for the government.
Oh, hi. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Let me just arrange my notes and I will start in a bit.
Okay.
All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. There has been a lot of presumptions in the opening half about what Facebook really wants to do and what Facebook is. But I just want to give you a concrete picture of what Facebook is and what it wants to do. And this comes from an interview with Chris Hughes, who is one of the co-founders of Facebook. And this is what he had to say about Mark Zuckerberg, that Mark has over 50% voting share in Facebook, that Facebook is just his vision, his idea. Whatever is in his mind, he can go through it, because the board of directors in Facebook are just people who are suggesting to Mark. They can't overrule Mark's opinion in what Facebook should be. That is an inhumane amount of power given to just one individual. Hughes further goes on to say that Mark is a deeply unpleasant person who is not open to new idea and who has shut out the co-founders who founded Facebook with him, and hence no other co-founder of Facebook is currently working with Mark Zuckerberg right now, because Mark is not welcoming to dissenting voices within Facebook. So all of their characterization why Facebook will innovate goes away by the simple interview of Chris Hughes, where he reveals all of the things that is wrong with Facebook. Congress hearings of Mark Zuckerberg has revealed the utter cluelessness that this person has about the harms that are being visited upon the rest of the world because of the cluelessness of Facebook. Its initial motto was move fast and break things. And this is exactly what Facebook did. It moved too fast into places where it should not have been in, and it broke things irreparably. I'll give you a big example, and this one comes from Myanmar. Facebook created the Rohingya massacre in Myanmar. And I'm not just making this up, right? This is true. Myanmar people started using Facebook broadly in 2011. And there was a lot of hatred that was spread by the Buddhist monks around the Rohingyas that were living in the Rakhine state of Myanmar. But Facebook did not flag a single post by those people. Why? Because Facebook had 2 translators of the Burmese language for the entire country of Myanmar, which meant that no one had any clue from Facebook what those posts were saying. And those posts were key to drumming up hatred against the Rohingya in Myanmar. And this is not a mistake that Facebook has gotten over. They're repeating the same mistake in Africa right now, where they've entered into Africa and they've fueled up the conflict between the Dinka and the Nuer tribe in South Sudan. They've fueled up the Tigrayan crisis in the Ethiopian region. All of these are Facebook's doing because of their motto of moving fast into places where they have no clue what the characterization or context is. They don't hire local specialists. They just move in there and break the fuck out of those places. Because Facebook relies on polarization. It supplies people with content that is in sync with the things you like. It leads to a creation of a bubble where you constantly get fed the thing that you already believe in. And this is the reason why I've seen a huge mobilization of conspiracy theories recently. You search QAnon once on Facebook and you keep getting recommendation of QAnon videos. And this is why QAnon is getting so powerful, more powerful than any other conspiracy theory has been. This is more important than opening government's argument about votes and democracy, because this is not just a hypothetical right to give votes. This is life threatening. The rise of the neo-Nazis can be largely attributed to Facebook's recklessness in America and in the rest of the world. Their flagging system is just not up to date because they don't have experts within region who understand the context of the language which is being used, because they just don't know what they're doing. But opening government opposition's biggest argument is one about competition and why R&D is expensive and you need a lot of money. Empirically, Facebook has literally not done shit over the last 10 years. You don't see a lot of innovation that is coming out of Facebook. That's just untrue. Furthermore, you discourage venture capitalistic endeavors because people who want to innovate and have ideas don't get money. And this is why they don't get money. When capitalists want to invest in a venture, they see how much they can get the return out of. But what happens is when Facebook comes into the play, what they do is they squash out all of the potential money that these people can get by just expanding a bit more, by telling them you need to sell to me right now or I'll just squash you out of the market. These people have no other option but to sell at a very low price to Facebook. And this is why tech startup investment has decreased from 2015. Furthermore, there's a class action lawsuit by app developers against Facebook, which again, opening government doesn't talk about. It comes from a 7,000-page secret document that was discovered early this year, which shows that Facebook has been actively using its market position to prevent ads of certain apps. It uses its investment in spyware and surveillance technologies to know what you're up to. So if you and your friend are cooking up something in your bedroom in Harvard, they know what you're cooking up. And even before you get it on the market, they can steal your idea and implement your idea before you implement that. All of this means Facebook has a huge control over innovation, right? But then they say, China will take over and it is worse. First, they never show why Facebook users will switch to Chinese companies, because there's a rise of Western xenophobia, which means not most Facebook users just won't go to Chinese companies. Second, I think Western governments can regulate Chinese giants, like Huawei is negotiating with the EU countries right now and coming to terms. So European giants and US has much more bargaining power over Chinese companies than it does over Facebook, which rules their economy right now. Congress hearings haven't done shit to Facebook. I think all of these things mean that you have a greater bargaining power here. And finally, if those companies turn out to be more problematic, we can just ban them as well. But I just want you to note, A similar problematic observation was made in the 1980s when there was a fight against IBM and AT&T, which met with the criticism that if you don't support IBM right now, Sony from Japan will take over and Japan will rule over the new computer world. But what really happened? AT&T was broken up into 7 companies, IBM was chased down to the door, and it was weakened significantly. What was the result of it? The weakened IBM allowed the flourishing of Apple and Microsoft. The baby bells, the smaller parts of AT&T, led to a better networking infrastructure in America. Internet arrived and developed further and faster within America. Why? Because a large AT&T would have acquired internet startups and made them weaker at its peak. But smaller AT&T parts, baby bells, led that to flourishing. When large companies acquire small ones, the small ones lose incentive to innovate because it is no longer their dream project. Because monopolies lack incentives to innovate, and expertise creates overconfidence and bias of the status quo. When you're Mark Zuckerberg, you're overconfident in what you have right now, so you go with your original formula. This is also agreed upon by Adam Grant, like a Wharton professor who wrote the book Originals, where he argues when you gain a lot of experience and expertise in the field, you become much more confident and you become much more closed off to originality. And this is what we're seeing with Facebook. They don't innovate, they fuck up people and they fuck up things. We're extremely proud.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for the speech, and now I'd like to call upon the third speaker for the opposition.
Sorry, just getting my document set up. Also, just as a note for POIs, I'll take them in the chat, but if I don't get to them at the 5:30 mark, just say them out loud. Sometimes I'm on another screen, so not looking at the chat isn't definitely, and I want to make sure to get to a POI. Starting with a few observations that I think will clean up the debate significantly. First, I think regardless of whether Facebook breaks up, they're still going to have a lot of users, even if there are fewer functions as a result. Like if they break up, like maybe the news page is separate, maybe like Instagram is separate, etc. Because people are still going to have Facebook regardless, I think there's still going to be a large amount of information that Facebook has access to, and there's basically the same consequences of things like targeted ad or like results of hacking, etc. We therefore think it's not like meaningfully making people's lives better or worse to break up Facebook in terms of like targeted ads or all these sorts of things like worries about hacking or like sharing information, etc. Secondly, I think in terms of what the model meant, that OG set up and what's like clearly meant by the motion, the Facebook breaking up means things like separating Instagram or WhatsApp. It's not like preventing Facebook from going to like international countries, i.e. things like the Myanmar, like things that happen in Myanmar, et cetera, or things that are currently happening in Africa still happen on either side of the house because that's not what's like meant by breaking up Facebook. They can still go to other countries internationally. Therefore, like, I think essentially what CG is doing is debating like an entire motion with like differently motion with this point of like whether or not Facebook should exist. Like Facebook exists on either side, therefore the harm still happen. So thirdly, I think that people are just obviously not going to switch or like leave Facebook as it serves like a distinct purpose as a social media in itself. First, I think it's important to recognize that the benefit of a social media and why you go on it in the first place is because a lot of people are on it there. I think the reason why people are unlikely to switch from Facebook to other things is not because like Facebook controls everything, but that's because there's inertia to do these things. i.e. I'm not going to switch and replace my social media. All my friends are on Facebook and they're probably also have inertia for the same reason, meaning that people stay on Facebook regardless of whether or not it's broken up. I think it's also important to note that unlike other monopolies and things like that, that social medias in different forms are usually add-ons, not replacements for each other. i.e. like I have Instagram because like, and Facebook because one is photos and the other is status updates. Or I have WhatsApp and Facebook because one is like messenger based or other is like how I get my news feeds, etc. What the reason why this is important is because this means that all of the antitrust arguments that we hear from the government literally make no sense because all of these like other social media platforms like Instagram, etc. still exist whether or not Facebook owns them or not. The reason why Facebook was buying these companies is not to remove competition because users still had Facebook even if they had Instagram or WhatsApp in the first place. Rather, the reason why they bought these things was just to improve profitability because it just is profitable to own like a company that is profitable in its own right. This means like the CG ideas of things like, oh, the reason why venture capital is going down is because like Facebook owns everything already is not true, because venture capital can still exist for companies that serve like a separate add-on purpose, and like maybe Facebook will buy them later, etc. That doesn't mean like venture capital doesn't exist for them in the first place. And also means that things like their IBM example also don't count, because IBM was like literally targeting companies that did the exact same thing. Facebook is not doing that. Like these companies like serve different purposes in like people's like social media landscape. Fourth, I think also it's just important to realize that like social media is currently like different from other forms of monopolies that we typically care about regulating for other reasons, such as like we usually care about like breaking up Standard Oil because it like literally makes like basic necessities and goods cost more. However, like for social media, it's literally free, so there's not really like the same degree of harm from having it be a monopoly. Therefore, I don't think it's like as big of a deal to break these things up. Our first major argument and extension is going to be why this breakup is meaningfully bad for users. I think this is an important argument because breakups are obviously motivated by how users are treated. And secondly, the project is like meant to benefit users. Thus, like maximizing those benefits is probably like best in all things considered. First, I think it's just good to have everyone on one platform, because that's like a major benefit to social media, is making sure that people are more connected to each other. We think there are like benefits to having like Facebook own these other sorts of companies, because first, it's like just literally easier to do things like log in and saving time with that. Like I just like that I can sign in to my social medias from like one account, etc. I think secondly, it also like saves time in terms of like, it's just nice to post photos on Instagram and Facebook at the same time. But lastly, I think integration is an incredibly good thing. I think the model point that they say where it's like, oh, we want like the news feed to be separate from videos and separate from status updates is actually really bad, at the point where people, like one of the major ways that like especially young people get used is just having everything on the same feed. I think you probably get far less informed people if you separate things, because they're probably just like not going to go to the separate news tab, at the point where it's like more of an effort to go to these things, and therefore you just get like less informed citizens overall. I also think that social media just tends to be much more harmful to users when it needs to do things like compete. And therefore, it's not actually better when competition exists, i.e. the way that social medias compete with each other is they do things like try to make their platforms more addictive and try to get things like echo chambers up so they can cater to like a base and like sort something out for themselves. This is why social media things like 4chan are incredibly damaging, because they are able to access the market through things like competition. But the way they access things is like making things more addictive to users. Like they have like worse like feedback loops on like how to like stop misinformation, etc. Therefore, you actually get much worse social media when you have things like competition, because if Facebook is not dominating the market, then they're going to be incentivized to do things like make the social media even more addictive, or all these like negative things that CG talks about, like because they watched that social media documentary on Netflix. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from opening if there is one.
So the specific size and power of Facebook means it's incredibly hard to regulate. At least if things are smaller, they can't lobby, etc. to the same extent.
Okay, that actually gets me to like my second point, so I'll just like talk about it there, like how we actually think you get more lobby or like more regulation on our side. But lastly, I'm just going to talk about how I think like targeted ads are actually like fairly good for users, because it allows you to first like be more aware of companies and purchases that cater to your interests. It's also like pretty good for things like small businesses who can't traditionally access things like big TV ads, but now get to target like ads directly to people. It's also good for things like charities, because now they can target ads to people who are like much more likely to donate them. They get more donations, etc. Facebook usually does things like makes like pro bono things for free, so it's just good to have these things. We also just think you're much more likely to get bad results when you do things like a breakup. First, I think you're much more likely to get good regulation when things are big, for a few reasons. First, it's much easier to change one person's mind about how to do things rather than several companies' minds about how to like do regulations regarding like targeted ads or data mining and things like that. I.e., it's like easier to change Mark Zuckerberg's mind than like 10 company CEOs' minds. So that's just better for regulation overall. I think secondly, like more attention is paid to by the populations and by the government if something is really big. For instance, like Twitter and Facebook have similar policies about user data, etc. But people will pay far more attention to places like Facebook and are much more interested in regulating Facebook because it is so much bigger than Twitter, etc. We think like things like Cambridge Analytica and the way the government is talking about it and the way that like the current US cycle of like elections has run make it so that Facebook is much more likely to be regulated in the future, and it's only more likely to be regulated if people pay attention to it and realize how big it is. We therefore think you're much more likely to get better regulation on our side of the house, and that the scale of these doing these things allows them to do like good things like election registration, etc.
Thank you very much. For the government.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
All right, just give me a few seconds. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think broadly speaking, all three houses in this debate does a very generic big tech debate. And I don't think this is really what the debate is about. And that is why I think closing government should be uniquely credited for Sajid's nuance when he says that Facebook is different from all other companies and all other big tech companies that Bench is so proud to defend, where they have internal changes, where they have R&D and shit and whatnot. And like all of those internal mechanisms of check and balance don't really work for Facebook because of the structural reasons that Sajid gave you with regards to how there are reasons why Mark Zuckerberg single-handedly can opt to be the one that makes decisions for Facebook and keeps individuals within an advisory role. There are reasons why this has happened. Notice how when Facebook does congressional, when like the Senate called Mark Zuckerberg, it was him who was brought into the account because he is the one who single-handedly controls vast majority of Facebook operations. But when lawsuits are presented, most of these are presented against Mark Zuckerberg individually. So you have to believe closing government's reason that Mark Zuckerberg has disproportionate power within this market. So the nuance given by closing government is that this is an individual as opposed to a company that has so much power that this is an individual psyche that determines how most operations of Facebook are run. Given that the mass scale of operation of Facebook is something that all houses agree upon, the debate then becomes whether or not it is okay and justified for an individual to have so much power, like consolidated within an entire country with so much power. I don't think like closing government or closing opposition or opening opposition at all engages with it. But I think the onus is on closing opposition to engage. So I don't think they necessarily have a stance within this debate. But what do closing opposition engage on? They sort of like dismiss Sajid's argument with regards to the issues of Myanmar and Africa and say Facebook will choose to exist in either world. The difference is that Sajid's nuance here is that Facebook right now manages to increase its capacity, acquire operations in other countries, acquire operations of like Israel's like social networking media, and then tap into that and rebrand it as Facebook or move into other nations because it can acquire data mining operations within those countries. The minute you break up Facebook, its ability to move in as fast as it did to places like Myanmar and places like in continents like Africa significantly goes down. So the scale at which they can manipulate certain societies and choose to ignore certain like red flags within those societies significantly go down. I think that is the marginal change that closing opposition needed to engage on, given that they didn't. I think closing government is clearly winning the bottom half of this debate. But the second thing that they say, and this is really funny, they say better regulations are possible because it's easy to big companies because like you can bring people up and you can like hold them accountable and whatnot. But I don't think these are effective, right? Because if that were true, a lot of existing regulations within Facebook would already been taking place. A lot of changes within Facebook have already taken place. But there aren't, right? Because we think we have been having this discussion for a long time now. The fact that we haven't had any meaningful change from Facebook, but even then we have not had any significant amount of innovation from them or any success with antitrust laws means that we have not been able to regulate them. But for other structural reasons as well, will not be able to regulate Facebook. Because I think the over-dependence that they talk about is contradictory in nature. Because if individuals are so indeed over-dependent on Facebook, that you encouraging small startups to actually start up so that they get bought out by Facebook, people have no incentive of moving out. And the more and more individuals stay within Facebook, the difficult it becomes for you to regulate those companies. And I think that is a self-contradictory argument from closing opposition. The next thing I want to talk about broadly within this debate is the idea that people won't leave Facebook, so it's better if other companies and other things like ultimately become a part of Facebook. And I think this is broadly talked about from opening opposition, where they basically focus their case on companies that want to be bought out, so they significantly start up just so that they can get acquired by Facebook. But at the same time, I think closing opposition hints at this by saying that it's okay, venture capitalists will still choose to exist for smaller companies. That is structurally untrue. The first thing I want to note is obviously Facebook bought off WhatsApp and Instagram because they were being competitive. Like Facebook already has a messaging service with Messenger. There is no structural reason why Facebook needed WhatsApp. You also had the ability to post photos on Facebook. There is no structural reason why Facebook needed Instagram, which means all of those are not need-based acquisition, but rather they're anti-competitive acquisition. Meaning that Snapchat, Instagram, and WhatsApp managed to threaten Facebook's competitiveness to a certain degree. But at the same time, I think they did provide new features to a lot of consumers. The story features or photo filter features which Instagram brought about were not present in Facebook to a large extent, meaning that there were avenues in the market through which other companies can actually tap into. But the reason why this is structurally decreasing right now is because less venture capitalists are spending on these companies because they know that there is no scope that these companies will grow up in the long run, but rather will be acquired by Facebook either ways. Meaning that the companies that do want to exist, the entire op page has no fail-safe mechanism to protect these corporations. And I think that is a massive fire that closing government brings about within this debate. So I think for those companies, the only mechanism by which you protect them is by breaking up. Because historically, Facebook has always acquired companies that hurt them and there is no structural reason why they will stop anytime soon, especially given the history that they have not innovated. All of Facebook's innovation has been by acquiring competitive markets, by the story features and etc. So for all of those reasons, I think we need to protect those companies, and closing government does it best. Before moving on, opening opposition if you have it.
Right. I just wanted to ask on this idea that like Facebook is affecting Rohingya Muslims because there were only 2 Burmese translators. Can you explain why breaking Facebook up and giving it less resources will somehow increase or better its impact on
No, because obviously they can't tap into more societies where they can manage the same amount of tapping. What they do now is focus on their home market shares and not try to move faster into other markets where they're not specialized to do so. Means that all in all, it will leave the fact to other companies to tap into, which are more specialized for those countries. Which means that Myanmar, there will be a specific social media platform that can actually rise up specifically localized within those industries, which doesn't have to compete with people. I think clearly it's not within our side of the house. But why do closing government win this debate? Because I would point out that almost all of the opening government's times have been entirely generic. And I think this pretty much sums up the top half debate, right? So we've been debating about regulating big tech. It's a nuance that Facebook, in and of itself, does not innovate like all other big tech companies that even the likes of Google have innovated. But Facebook doesn't. The fact that has no executive body in and of itself that manages to control the internal change mechanisms also is problematic. For all of those reasons, we think Facebook uniquely has a lot of harms in society which we have to correct. And the only way to do that is by breaking up Facebook. Vote for closing government.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for the speech. And now I'd like to call upon the last speaker for the opposition.
Okay, awesome. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I will take POIs in the chat, but if I get to 5:30 and I haven't taken one, feel free to just unmute. Okay, 3, 2, 1. I think this debate has been very messy, and I think the way CEO wins is by being very simple and accurate as to how social media actually works and the results of this policy. I think there are a couple things that are important to note that Amna points out they don't think get sufficient response. First, I think there is a big point, which is the fact that you don't pay, the fact that social media is funded by ads undercuts a major part of the justification for why you would break up because competition is good, because usually the argument is that it lowers prices. The second point is that you use multiple platforms, so they still have your data either way, which is to say you're not getting any of these benefits of data, preventing data mining or doing these things. Because I still have a TikTok, I also have a Facebook, I use multiple platforms. I'll probably actually just spend more time scrolling through 5 different feeds instead. You stay on these platforms because your friends are already on them, so you're less likely to change. It doesn't really change anything via startups and stuff, because the same incentives apply whether or not Facebook is broken up. I'm still going to be on Instagram regardless of whether or not Facebook uses it. These are not changed if Facebook breaks up. Then I think that it actually makes it much, much worse if you break them up. Why? The reason that I think, unlike a lot of other products, social media does more harm, makes more money or gains more users by being worse as a platform in order to draw users in, which is to say, if I am competing with Instagram and like Facebook and Instagram are now competing, I as like running Facebook want to make it as addictive as possible. I want to keep people scrolling. I want to keep people commenting. I want to create echo chambers. I want to create sensationalist headlines that will get fake news. Social media becomes worse and people use it more. That is the problem with competition. So if you are competing with other social media platforms in order to get users in, you want to make it as addictive as possible, which makes it much worse. However, if Facebook is the main platform or the only platform, you're much more willing to do things like regulate, to do things like changing it to be better because you don't have this fear of losing amount of money or losing users to another platform. This means that when you break up Facebook and create more competition, it ends up with worse products for users. But the other thing that we tell you is it's simply just better for users if it's all integrated. It's just much nicer, right? Which is to say, like Anna tells you, it's going to be all integrated. I can log in easily. I can post photos easily. I can find my friends on Facebook, on Instagram. It's just nice. There's also a scale to it. So it's like, and there's like an ease of posting. So like, there's also a lot more security because they have like a lot bigger systems. This means it's like, I think it responds to OG concerns. I'd rather not have my data with a bunch of small startups. I think they're probably going to have a lot worse security data. And I think it's just likely that you just spend time on like 5 different feeds instead. I don't think you get any better. But I actually think then, finally, in response to what both OG and CG tell you, you're going to get more regulation by doing these things. A couple of reasons for this. One, the way regulation happens, this is in response to like what OG says at the beginning about regulation. The way regulation happens is like, one, it's easier just to convince Mark Zuckerberg if he supposedly runs everything that he should do this. 2, he doesn't have as much fear of competition if he owns all the platforms. So it's not like they have to all work together. All Mark Zuckerberg does have to do it. And he knows everyone else will be doing this as well. So he's at no disadvantage. But it's also just, you get way more attention. Like, I'm gonna be honest, convincing like an 80-year-old senator to pass social media regulation is hard enough. It's much harder if he has to understand the intricacies of like 10 different platforms. It's much easier to just say, we're gonna put these rules on this company. Very easy to understand. I think there's going to be less resistance. Additionally, in response to OG, in response to CG, I think it's much better if Facebook is doing this when it is based in the US and has these things. I think the US has much stronger free speech laws and ethical norms and greater degrees of regulation. This is much better than small startups in corrupt countries, especially if this country is committing genocide, because let me tell you, I don't really trust the Myanmar government to regulate harms against minorities. The US has strong free speech laws, but also has strong ethical norms. This means you prevent the worst types of censorship, but you also do things like at least flag posts as like false and misleading, or like remove people who are doing the best regulation. So I think you're more likely to get good regulation. So I think, and finally, in response to CG, I think it's not true that we have not had success in regulating Facebook. We in fact have. We now flag fake news. Users have more control over their data after Cambridge Analytica. Like, we've added a lot of policies in recent years that do change Facebook and have made it much better. I think it's been much easier to do. Now let's go on to some specific rebuttal. First, like, I think it is like, this idea is like, oh, you can't opt out from OG. Oh, you can't opt out because there's like, you like have no other options. This is true on both sides, which is I'm still going to use multiple sites. I still use Instagram and Facebook, even though they're multiple sites anyway, they're just owned by the same company. So this is not true. Then you talk about how like, there's just like, you like shouldn't be buying all these companies. I just don't think this like point makes much sense, or is that where? I think then they talk about how you're unaware of your data being used. Again, like I think the data exists either way because I'm still on this. I don't actually think that Facebook gains that much data by knowing what I post on Instagram. Like it's more likely that it's like my likes and clicks in the newsfeed that give them most of their data. That still exists either way. Finally, then they try to talk about how Google is going to buy startups. In that case, this debate is dumb because then all of your harms still exist. It's just Google instead of Facebook, and it's just a huge waste of time. And it just makes everything more inconvenient for users. So if this is true, then only harms that exist are the fact that integration is worse. We clearly win on that. Then we have closing government. I will take actually opening government, a POI from opening government.
Yeah, the specific harm is that Facebook is now able to collect data from loads of different aspects from your newsfeed, etc. And so governments, politicians can buy that data up from one access point. Surely if it's lots of different companies collecting it, that happens a lot less.
One, Twitter still has massive amounts of data on you, even though it doesn't own a lot of sites. I think Facebook still has massive amounts of data either way. 2, a lot easier to regulate if you do these things. So it's much better off. 3, I think the fact that Google still has access to all these data means your data is still on the internet no matter what. So you're not going to get these changed. These these evil political people could just buy it from them. I don't see anything like it's true. More likely to get regulation post Cambridge Analytica scandal than you would be otherwise. Closing government, look, I'm gonna be like their extension just is like they're out of the rounds. This doesn't make any sense. They just watched the Social Network movie and like now they're saying this. Facebook can do way more when it has more translators. It can better regulate when it's subject to US regulations. You're more likely to protect minorities. Facebook still exists internationally either way. This doesn't even solve the issue they're talking about. Like this idea that's like you're going to steal all your ideas and like control innovation. This is just not true. They basically, their example is just a bunch of like, they argue like by means of example that doesn't prove anything. And I honestly don't know if half of it is true. I think they are pretty clearly out of the round. What do we tell you that wins the round? I think first, I think we have the most realistic conception of what social media looks like. Second, I think we tell you about who the group that matters most, which is to say the users. All of this is done to benefit the users. So we ought to care about how they're affected as a result. We tell you why these integrated platforms are a good thing in general. We tell you why targeted ads are a good thing in general. And I think it's just like doing these things. But second, we tell you why you're going to get all the regulation, which solves all of the harms. I think just in comparison to OO, I think like their impacts are like, I think probably more nebulous, like maybe China comes in, maybe it doesn't. Like, I don't really know how much these things change. I think what's pretty clear is how people react to social media. I think it's pretty clear how you do these things. We tell you that it's going to harm users, it's going to harm regulation. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank speaker and everyone for the debate. Please be careful.
Thanks, everybody.
All the debaters can leave this Zoom and judges should remain here. Thank you.